we just saw. This is joint work with my mentor at Twitter, Luca Belli, and my PhD advisor, Moritz Hart. So the paper is called From Optimizing Engagement to Measuring Value. So I'm going to go over the first part of this first, which is the optimizing for engagement part. So this is the part that platforms do currently. We're all familiar with these kinds of platforms that rank content you see using machine learning algorithms. One of the most basic ways to come up with some objective for ranking content is by using a behavioral signal. So in its simplest form, we could say that we're going to optimize for clicks. So what this means is that for every piece of content you see, the recommender system logs whether or not you clicked on it. And we're going to create a model that predicts from those features of the items whether you're going to click on the item or not. In practice, these platforms have many different kinds of signals, so the objective is actually a little bit more complicated. It's usually some sort of weighted combination of various kinds of signals, clicking, favorites, replying, etc. Of course, optimizing for engagement also leads to many perverse outcomes. So I've already shown some of you this graph. This is a chart that Mark Zuckerberg posted on his Facebook. So it comes from research that they've done at Facebook. They found that no matter where they draw the policy line for what kind of content is allowed, as content gets closer to that line, engagement with that content increases. Interestingly enough, as part of the post, he says, our research suggests that no matter where we draw the lines for what is allowed, as a piece of content gets close to that line, people will engage with it more on average, even when they tell us afterwards that they don't like the content. So what this suggests is it's not just that people like this sensationalized clickbaity content more and just want more of it in their feeds. Instead, the issue is that sometimes what we engage with is not necessarily the same as what we might reflectively value. And recommender systems today almost focus exclusively on these kinds of behavioral signals rather than some kind of deeper, more reflective notion of value. So this is where we get into the work of this paper. The goal of this work was to try to come up with some kind of framework in which we can start thinking about measuring some sort of more reflective value to use as an objective function for recommendation. The words here are very carefully chosen, both measuring and value. Measuring because we want to draw from this great body of work in measurement theory. So I've been saying value. Value is a super vague concept. What does that mean? Here in this talk, I'm mostly just going to be focused on a definition of value that is kind of individual. What would the individual reflectively value? At the end, I'll sort of talk about how this connects to more broader societal value. But even just that alone, what is the individual value is very vague. Luckily, there is a big field that has studied how we operationalize these sorts of vague theoretical constructs in the quantitative social sciences for a long time. And we can draw on lessons learned from measurement theory to understand how we should measure something like value on recommender systems. So in the measurement theory way of thinking, we start with some kind of theoretical construct. We have an idea of what value is in our heads. But then we need to operationalize value as something that is quantified, that is a variable. And unfortunately, this variable is latent. I can't look at you and a piece of content and just see it. You had 1.52 value with this content. Instead, we have to learn what value is through observed behaviors. In the recommender system setting, this is mostly the behaviors that you have on the platform. Things like favorites, retweets, replies, click, they provide some evidence of value, but they are not value in and of themselves. So if we have these observed behaviors, we should be able to infer something about value. But of course, value is, again, distinct from the behaviors itself. So the way that we relate the observed behaviors to value is through what's known as a measurement model, which is a statistical model that defines how the sort of observed evidence relates to this latent variable value. So from this measurement model, which of course I'll talk about how we get in a second, we would get out the joint distribution of these variables, the probability of value and all the observed behaviors. How do we then use that in recommendation? Well, we do very similarly to what we did before. We now replace the objective with this probability of value given the observed behaviors. And we hope that, of course, we can capture something that's somewhat distinct. So once we have our measurement of value, we can use established approaches to assessing the construct validity of measurement to see how our operationalization of value differs from the construct itself that we mean to capture. Interestingly enough, while there is this gap between the measurement of value and the construct, there's also this gap between the observed behaviors and the operationalization of value. And most recommender systems only look at this part of it. How well are we optimizing for behavior? So we hope that by expanding this picture, even if we aren't able to capture this theoretical construct completely, just this framework of thinking can help us get closer to it. So what exactly is the measurement model, of course? How do we relate this observed evidence to value? So this is the meat of our contribution in this paper, is a method that is designed specifically for recommender systems. So again, we have our behaviors, we have our latent variable value. All the observed behaviors are, of course, binary. You either favorite something or you don't. We're also going to conceptualize a value here as being binary. You value this piece of content or you do not. We will represent the conditional independences between these variables as a Bayes net. So for example, and don't worry if you don't have background on Bayes nets, the main thing is that it defines certain structural relationships between these variables. So for example, here I would say that favorite and click are conditionally independent given value. You might question that kind of assumption though, because users usually have to click on something before they favorite it. So you might use a different kind of Bayes net. So mainly the Bayes net encodes these assumptions on how the user interacts with these different variables. But the Bayes net just tells us about sort of the structure here, and it doesn't actually give us this joint distribution. So how do we learn what this joint distribution should be? Luckily for us, on most of these platforms, even if we don't know the relationship between value and all of the behaviors, there usually is some behavior which you're pretty certain about. So most of these platforms have very explicit kinds of behavior, like reporting content, clicking see less often, upvoting or downvoting. And we can actually formalize the relationship between value and these behaviors as an assumption. So for example, if you click see less often on a tweet, you're pretty confident you don't value the tweet. So we can formalize that assumption and write that the probability the user values that tweet, given they've clicked see less often, is 0. We call this kind of variable an anchor variable. It's kind of explicit feedback for which we know that when we see this kind of feedback, either the user values the piece of content or they don't value it. And it turns out just having this one anchor variable is going to be sufficient to learn what the full joint distribution should be in order to be consistent with the assumption on the anchor variable. So the main sort of result in our paper is a theorem that I'm just going to skip going over, but essentially what it says is that through a few distributions that we can very easily get, including with this anchor assumption, those will uniquely identify the joint distribution of the latent variable model. So to put it more intuitively, the designer has sort of two main levers to pull when developing this measurement of value. They can choose what the anchor variable is, which is basically the normative choice. This is saying this behavior is related to value in this way, and that's what's going to anchor how we interpret all the other behaviors. And they also choose the Bayes net, and that's more just like a structural substantive assumption on how the user interacts with this platform. Together, these two design choices are going to give us a measurement of value that we can interrogate. So we applied this to recommendations at Twitter for Twitter's ML-based push notifications. So just to get on the same page about how ML-based push notifications work on Twitter, These notifications you might get to your home screen, from which you can open and see a tweet, or you could be in Twitter, see a notification in your notifications tab, click on it, and then after opening or clicking the tweet, you can obviously engage with it in many ways. You can also, from notifications tab, click see less often. We're going to be using this as our anchor variable. And at any point, you can opt out of notifications altogether. So using the method we developed, using see less often as our anchor and a basenet we wrote down, we're able to get out a measurement of value. Of course, the question is, what is this measurement of value? How do we assess whether it captures what we want? And so again, to do that, we can rely on established methods for assessing construct validity. So for example, in the latest sort of gold standard for measurement, there are 5 types of evidence for validity. Here in this work, we're just going to focus on internal structure. Evidence based on internal structure refers to checking that the internal variables that make up your measurement follow theoretical relationships you expect to hold. So to sort of get an idea of that, I'm going to show a table of the probability of value given each behavior. And we have certain things we expect, like we expect the probability of value given click to say be lower than the probability of value given favorite. We expect the probability of value given opt out to be very low. But the other behaviors to sort of increase the probability of value beyond the baseline. So I'm going to show this to you for 2 basenets so you can see how the basenet affects the inferences we get. I'm going to skip the naive Bayes model, which we just use as a very simple baseline to show people. It doesn't work at all. We never actually considered that, just showing it in the paper. The first model we wrote down basically just encodes all the hard prerequisites that exist on the platform. So for example, you have to be in notifications tab before you click on a notification. You can also just open the notification directly from your home screen. After opening and clicking the notification, you can engage with the tweet in many different ways. You can also opt out of notifications at any point. From notifications tab, you can click on see less often. And then value, we assume, can affect all these behaviors, except notifications tab, which is just like a random event being in notifications tab. So what do we get out of this first model? So basically, it doesn't really work. So the baseline, the prior probability of value is 0.5. And so, we do get that like favorite and retweet provide the greatest evidence of value, which makes sense. But a lot of behaviors are providing negative evidence of value that are kind of surprising, like open, click, etc. And so we went back to see, was there something that we sort of missed here? And the thing we realized when we looked at the data is, although this model captures all the hard prerequisites, what we're missing is that most people, before they click see less often on a tweet, click or open the tweet so they can see what it is. And so even though this isn't a hard prerequisite, it basically is something that users do. So we drew in 2 additional arrows from click and open to see less often to get our full model, which actually makes just like a lot of sense on first glance. Favorite, retweet provide the highest evidence of value. Opt out, probability of value given opt out is basically 0. Click is less than like reply, that kind of thing. But it also makes very interesting, more fine-grained inferences than that. I don't really have time to go into these, so I'm not going to talk about it, but it's very cool to see sort of fine-grained inferences that you don't have to build in coming out of this model. So we talked about internal structure. That was just one small part of what we want to say, you should do when trying to evaluate this kind of measurement. I'm not going to go over all of these, but just talking about, relations with other variables, you would hope that your measurement of value, I'm on the wrong picture, but whatever, your measurement of value also, correlates with user surveys of satisfaction, but is different than like say clicks. And then consequences, you would hope that when you actually deploy this model of value, which so far I've talked about is very individual, also doesn't have like broad scale bad societal effects. Yeah. And so to just summarize, I've like talked to you about a way of thinking about developing objectives that allows us to interrogate the difference between the operationalization and what we value. And I will end there. Thank you. My Spotify.
Okay, thank you so much, Smitha. Okay, I'm going to ask Sarah and Peter and Smitha to come back up here, and then we can start taking audience questions. So if you just raise your hand, get a nod from me, which means I've noted you and taken your name down, and then we can start running through questions. So, okay, I'm going to come back here to Bernard first, and then once I give him the mic, just hold your hands up and I'll get everybody on the queue.
Yeah, thank you all for these really interesting papers. I just have a very immediate question for Smitha, which I just wanted to know how that your measurements sort of fed back to this idea of a policy line, and you know, if that's something that you can, is that something that is sort of easily quantifiable in the sense, because that curve is really interesting, and it kind of, just in a very sort of slightly stupid way, it kind of reminds me of like that classic idea that that's found in like St. Paul and in psychoanalysis, like, you know, the boundary or the ban is the thing that elicits desire. And yeah, so I just wonder if there's any way to sort of translate into that kind of more abstract sort of way of thinking about that, you know, and yeah, how those kinds of, that policy line adds up. I wish I could think through questions to the other people, because there's fascinating papers, but yeah, I'll just.
And we actually have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to double them up. So hold that question, and I'm going to take Connell as well.
Thank you. Fantastic papers. I have a lot to ask of everyone, but I won't, given the limits. And I'll say some things, Peter, that I hope in my talk later today that I hope we can talk about later. My question's for Sarah, and it's on the, I mean, I'm generally nervous about the creation of new rights, like bespoke rights, specifically as a response to new technologies, rather than handling them through more holistic paradigms. So that's my baseline. I'm nervous, but my question is, would the exercise of the right that you're talking about depend on a prior right to contestation? So what is the trigger mechanism that lets you exercise this right? Because it seems like the attention at the moment is on this right to contest. So how does your right relate to that? And then related to that, it seemed like you worked through very different contexts in your talk. I counted about sort of 3 or 4 really distinct, really different working practical contexts. And it struck me that the kind of harm that comes up in those contexts could be quite different, and you could realize the harm at very different points within, you know, that, let's call it a workflow. So how does that relate? Like, when and how can you exercise a right like that under those harm conditions?
All right, you guys can take your questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thanks, Bernard. That question. So yeah, I guess the question is, to my understanding, how does what I've talked about, could that actually kind of counteract the graph that I showed, where, you know, sensationalized content always gets more engagement, or wherever you draw the policy line, it gets more engagement. So I would say this is kind of like a long-term, like 5-year goal of mine. But it's actually, there are a lot of complications to being able to measure whether an objective actually has this kind of effect of like decreasing sensationalized content or not. So we are doing some other experiments just measuring effects of Twitter's ranking algorithm. And we do see some perverse effects that I can like talk about offline, and separately are also doing some experiments to see how like the choice of objective function in different contexts affects the kind of content that you get, but it's hard to link everything together because like to deploy an objective in a real world setting, you need to be on a platform, but then those platforms themselves do not have the measures ready to measure those kinds of things. Like there's like no measure of like, you know, how angry are tweets that we are recommending or something. So yeah, it just takes a long time to link up all the parts.
So thank you for the question. That's actually perfect. And I really appreciate this kind of pushback because I think we're still actually workshopping that. Because we appreciate the fact that, you know, just creating a new right or claiming a new right is something relatively consequential and shouldn't be taken lightly. And so we're actually working through whether or not we can ground it in existing concepts, and that might make it not only stronger, but also justify it better. So we've kind of looked at both dignity and equality and read across a few actual new proposed rights like the right to reasonable inferences. And so I think I'd love to have a longer discussion with you about that afterwards too, to get your thoughts. The second question you had was about contestation. That would indeed be a huge part of it. I think there's both kind of ex ante and ex post actions that you can take here. But it is largely, you know, there's Margot Kaminsky and I think Jennifer Urban's right to contest AI. And I think it would be really largely building off of that. There was a second part to your question that I don't remember.
When different harms arise, like when can you exercise the right in relation to the harm? Is what I mean.
Right. So the first consideration is that risk of harm. And that is going to kind of affect when you can exercise that right. And that's kind of the measurement stick where you are not only evaluating harm, but you're also looking at who are the other stakeholders in the system, what are the other costs that you impose on the decision maker or on other individuals. So you can think of judicial economy as a scenario where actually they don't necessarily want to have a ton of individualization if it imposes a lot of cost on the judicial system. And so you might actually trade off for these things. I don't know if that's answering your question, but thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear? Is this on?
No, I turned it off.
Okay, so cornucopia of ideas, and I wanted to sort of engage everyone, hopefully on mini points that won't sort of take up the whole time. So for Smitha, I was really interested at the end, the value that had the 1.0 was the quote retweet. And that just seems like what we hear, especially if you're trying to develop a following in academia, you want to respond to really polarizing material. And I'm just wondering if that just seems to be feeding in more. I mean, it seemed intuitive, but at the other hand, it seemed like I might respond to something I really don't value and to tell everybody, this is really what I hate. Anyway, so I wanted to follow up on that. And then also to engage Sarah and Peter sort of along the same dimensions. Your talks sort of interestingly overlapped. So Peter, when we have this idea of the collaboration where the brains are melding and it's non-strategic, what kind of a response to this digital era is this? Do we all need to become Buddhists and we bring that, like all of us that are engaging this world become Buddhists, or do we need to not do the digital world? So just tell us what to do. And then for Sarah, I was in your talk, well, first of all, can you say why it's so, you personified the platform so many times and talked about it as an I, and I'd really like you to like, why is this platform an I, and why do I need to engage it in that way? And the model of trust that you use is all rational choice in terms of rational actor. And this model of trust is not the collaborative one that would be in the Peter's version of we collaborate intentionally and we meld our brainwaves. It's all where our apprentices are aligned and it's all automated and it's all rational actor. Thank you.
Great. Okay, hold those. Helen's going to ask her question as well.
Yeah, it's amazing because I had some very similar reactions to yours, and also like a question about for each. First of all, Sarah, forgive me, I'm going to be that person who says, I have a few articles that I've written on trust online. And in one of them, I kind of integrate a lot of the philosophical work, including Russell Hardin's, but looking at in the digital domain and why it poses such difficulty for the concept of trust, precisely because there is a difference between trusting humans and then trusting systems. And sometimes philosophers will suggest that we actually use a different term but anyway, I would like to suggest those to you. I can send them. But then back to that question of rationality, you mentioned Hardin. Hardin mentions this idea of you trust, and others, we're very forgiving if someone harms us, unless we see it as coming from an intention. And that intention suggests future behaviors. But if it's accidental, humans are very forgiving. So there is some rationality that I don't think you can get away from. And, it might be a good idea to kind of just think about how that fits. For Peter, maybe a similar question too, is that I loved some of the insights and kept saying to myself, do I need to become a Buddhist? Or is there a way to reason to some of those insights from a different kind of platform? And then Smitha, I'm going to use the word overfit in a way that I'm not sure it's actually precisely correct, but to what extent are your is the operationalization of value that you've given, which is very smart, but to what extent can it be extended anywhere beyond Twitter? Are you hopeful to extend it? But it seems very kind of integrated to the various capacities that Twitter has. So.
No, I don't think everybody needs to be Buddhist, number one, but I think that it's important that in engaging new technologies, when we begin participating in these relational media, that we have to be coming in with eyes wide open. I mean, we don't enter intimate relationships with others without eyes wide open, yet we somehow assume that we can enter a very intimate relationship with technology to the extent that we become participatory within it. That it starts to inform the very shaping of the own infrastructure of our presence personally. But we sort of take that as being a neutral choice. And I think we really should problematize that there's no neutrality at all in engaging with technologies. Technologies are always value laden. They're in fact materializing human values. So we can't get around that. So I think a first step is, yes, coming in with eyes wide open. And what does that mean? Well, I think, yes, meditative practices are good because one of the things that you do is focus on patterns of attention, see how your pattern arises and how it shifts and how it forms and where thoughts come from. And sooner or later you realize through meditating, you're not in charge of your own thoughts and you're not in charge of your emotions, and these things are happening. And then you go a little bit deeper and you start to realize, however, there is a way of not exerting control over them, but of being present in a way that the compulsive nature of choosing, the compulsive nature of being present can be slowly dissolved. So I think that this can be framed in terms of moving away from a logic where freedom of choice is the determining factor of how we engage with these technologies. You're free to engage or free to not to engage. And I think that sort of philosophically, that's why that tool and technology distinction is so important, because we cannot use tools. I didn't have a smartphone until about 4 years ago when my wife and son insisted. I'm traveling too much, they can't get a hold of me and so on. But I use it as a dumb phone. So I don't use it as a smartphone. But I can't get around the way in which communication technologies have changed communication practices within families, among friends. And so when I traveled in Asia and was telling people I don't have a smartphone and I can't connect with you via WeChat, they think that I'm telling them that because I don't want to have anything to do with them. They took it as a personal affront. And so it's sort of like, okay, I have to participate in this. There's no way out of it if I'm going to be a member of society. So your option is to withdraw completely or to engage in a way where at least you're responsible for your engagement. So I think what can help us do that, I think anything that gives us a longer perspective on things than immediate sense gratification, immediate emotional gratification, anything that helps us as human beings to look further over that horizon and to say, where do we want to be? What are the relational dynamics that we want to engage in? Then I think that's a really important part of this process. And that's really about education. So if it was me, I'd say preschoolers all get training in basic attention training, and from that point, at least be able to be critical about what's happening to their own minds as they're engaging the world around them.
Okay, thank you for the questions. So I'm going to start off with the personification one. Didn't notice I was doing it, but I do think there's a justification for why I was doing it, which is that it comes from kind of the language that we speak. If I were presenting here and I was speaking on how to design recommender systems, which is we often say, we want to do this, we want to do that. It might have even shown up in the third talk, in that maybe the algorithms themselves aren't people, but the choices behind them are very much ones that designers make. And so we say, we're going to decide to maybe model this individual as having fixed preferences, and we're going to use clicks as proxies for their interest, or maybe not clicks. We're going to use whether they retweet as a proxy for interest. So I think, didn't notice I was doing it. I'm glad you pointed it out. Really interesting question. Second thing I think both you and Helen asked about was rationality. And I might be misunderstanding where you're coming from rationality, but I don't actually agree. I don't think the model that we adopt requires rationality, in the sense that the kind of way that rationality as a concept arose in economics was, you have this kind of base metric of what's beneficial to you, and that's going to be measured in money. And you occasionally will act irrationally, where this very clear unit of utility, you aren't kind of honoring that. But the way that we look at it is actually going to capture and honor different ways that individuals interact with a recommender system. So I could be an individual who doesn't care at all. I don't strategize at all because I'm like, you know what, my data's out there, it's out there. I'm going to let the platform do whatever they want with it. That's also going to be captured. Or I could be someone who really, really cares and tries to mask everything about me. That's also going to be captured. Or I could be an individual who has different short-term and long-term preferences. That's also going to be captured. Or I could be an individual who has two different moods. Sometimes I want to be shopping for professional clothing. Sometimes I want to be shopping for casual clothing. That is also going to be captured. So I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, but that our formalization is flexible enough to account for those behaviors. And Helen might have had another question, but I don't remember, and just want to thank you for pointing out that there are other works. And this is an ongoing work, so I'm glad that you're bringing those to our attention.
Chat about the rational stuff was
Yeah, for Sonia's question about the quote retweet, I actually get this question a lot because obviously quotes on like Twitter timeline are super nasty. So people are like, why is the probability of value giving quote really high? So you have to remember that we did this on specifically Twitter's ML-based push notifications. So it wasn't the recommendations for like tweets you see in your timeline. And these push notifications are already filtered to basically be like notifications from your friend. So they're already mainly notifications that you like. They're not from like, I don't know, the others. So I think you see less of that nasty behavior, but that does go to show that these behaviors are super contextual, depend on like the recommendations people are getting. That's just a problem in general with these offline recommendations. So another thing that like is useful about this method practically is that you can just re-estimate this at any point. Like it takes like 5 minutes to run once you have the data, or well, less than that, like 30 seconds. And then you have this new measurement of value. So as people change how they behave on the platform, obviously how that relates to value changes. And so the engineers on this team were actually very excited about this from a practical perspective, because how they do it by default is like, we just test these weights in A/B tests and have no idea how to pick them. So having some sort of principled way to re-estimate this was a big draw for them. And then secondly, to Helen's question about how much does this generalize beyond Twitter, I think like for a lot of platforms, it can be sort of plugged in easily when you have like these binary behaviors. A lot of platforms don't do their recommendation based on just like binary behaviors. It's more like watch time, that sort of thing. So this model doesn't easily, like exactly what I wrote, doesn't easily extend to continuous features. We have been exploring doing like approximations with different kinds of like latent variable inference that can let you extend it, but also the more broadly, the general framework that I want to push for of like thinking about these things from a measurement style, like definitely applies. And I think kind of opens up the box on like what we think these objectives are.
Minutes and a bunch of questions, so I'm going to do like a gather all the questions, and then maybe each of you can like pick a question you want to answer. So Jake, can start with you.
Okay, thanks. I'll try and keep it as simple as possible, but I love this panel so much, and I think it's really connected to some of the things we've been talking about already and the theme, and I want to congratulate the curatorial team for putting it together. So as quick as I can. So for instance, for Peter, I really loved your presentation. I think we've been talking a little bit so far about second order cybernetics as well. And it made me think very much of the work of like Francisco Varela. And so I suppose my question is, could you perhaps offer something or your thoughts around some of these sort of related concepts of consciousness, self-identity that come from Varela, and even to an extent like Gunther Teubner in the context of legal identity, where they include this sort of these relational and non-individualistic foundations for the formation of subjectivity, but they don't necessarily have to be between humans. They can be between other forms of agents as well. I also, this have a quick question for Sarah, but it very much relates to Smitha's paper as well, and also these questions that have happened before. I mean, in the game theory approach to modeling human interaction with a recommender system, what are the strategic imperatives of each party? And because when we think about game theory approaches where, and strategic behavior, like people, they might not report their true valuation of something in order to try maybe get a better price for it or something like that. But what are we thinking that the human wants to get out of their interaction with the recommender system? And what does the recommender system want to get out of their interaction with the human? And to an extent, it goes to this work that Smitha is doing. It's like, how do we define, like inevitably we have to flatten value to measure it, but to what extent, like, is value necessarily inscribed by the system or the designers of the system through the mechanisms that we have to measure it? And part of that question then is also like, if you're using a game theory approach that's not premised on human rationality, however you want to define it, like there are other definitions of rationality that are potentially more complex, but what are the categories you use to model human behavior and cognition?
I'll try to be as brief as possible. To the first speaker, I think it's a very interesting proposal, right, to be an exception. One thing to sort of just to mention as a person involved in legal research, this is a deep question, right? Well, what determines if a case is an exception to a rule, right? In fact, there's a saying that exceptions prove the rule and so on, right? And one of the things that sort of struck out to me as being a bit of a big issue is that sort of rights are just the other side of obligations, right? If I have a right to something, someone has an obligation to do something for me, and I can choose to not exercise it, right? In these contexts, one of the things you mentioned is the determination of uniqueness, right? Or individualization, whatever, right? Somebody has to determine that. right? That itself is going to have rules. And what happens a lot of times is, especially from people who are in statistics and CS, they propose these ways to improve these terribly unjust systems. And what this does is essentially just creates these tick the box situations where they say, okay, I took this into account. I added this variable. Now this is just, right? So, and from a legal perspective, right, this creates a lot of difficulties for us in the legal domain because we don't know math. The reason we go to law school is because we don't know math, right? So anyway, I think that should be something that should be emphasized, like, you know, hey, this is not a way to sort of justify these unjust systems, right? And yeah, just what determines uniqueness is itself a fundamentally difficult question. Like, if I'm on, if a parole decision is being made on me, right? Why am I not unique and another person is unique? That's some bureaucrat sitting there and making this determination, right? So anyway, that's just some general comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question for Peter that was around why you chose the term hacking. You know, I would understand sort of a lot of what you're talking about through, say, the philosophy of Karen Barad, who we spoke about yesterday. And so when, you know, if you're not outside the phenomena with which you're measuring, when performing an experiment, for example. And so the term hacking, I feel like, implies like an outside external actor who then, you know, does something to like a system that they're not involved with. So just a clarification on why the term hacking specifically. And then for Smitha, amazing paper. And I just had a question around, when you do your A/B testing, are you testing on sort of specific group, like, is this even generalizable across Twitter, such that like some communities use and interact differently to others? For example, academic communities who are using it for a specific purpose, for promotion, and I don't want to look like a dickhead in front of like my colleagues or whatever, but some people don't mind being like that on Twitter, right? So yeah, I mean, how do different types of is that something you account for when you're designing this sort of value, that certain communities use things in certain ways and have engagement and give signals that are some kind of way, which is totally different to how another community might do that?
Okay, we're going to get one more question. We're pretty low on time. So, you know, lightning round responses, and then hopefully we can carry forward during the break, the conversations.
Thanks. I love this panel. This is great. I had questions for Peter. I was really interested in the definitions of tools and technologies, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because I got the impression that they referred to different phenomena or things, and yet it's got to be relational, right? Like one person's tool is another person's technology. Like a recommender system, it sounds like was a technology here, but for someone working at Facebook, it's a tool, if that makes sense. So just like clarification on that, I was curious about. And then I'd love, we'll probably just talk about this later, but I'd love to push you on what attention means and on specifically what's new about the new attention economy.
Okay, I'm gonna try to go between the three. So Varela, hacking, and new about the attention economy. Varela was, for those of you who don't know, he was originally trained as a biologist, I believe, and was interested in how cells communicate, how communication occurs within an organism. And he was really interesting in the sense that he wanted to move away from this sender-receiver model of communication, and to say that what you have is not two separate sender and a receiver. What you've got is a relational pattern that's playing out over time. And you can't understand organisms and perception and cognition without understanding that. Organisms arise in connection with their environment. So it was kind of an early version of an activist theories of cognition or mind that's going on. But it has some connections with people like Andy Clark and his theorizing of extended mind. I think what Buddhism brings into this is a much longer historical perspective, where the arising of something like subjectivity is connected with an emergence of a new kind of consciousness. So in Yogacara Buddhism, you have 8 consciousnesses. Not humans don't have one, we've got 8. So visual consciousness is the elaboration of visual relations in order. Auditory consciousness is the elaboration of auditory relations in order, et cetera, for smell, taste, touch. Cognition is something that's different in that it is elaborating relations among the sensory streams that are going on in the other 5 sense consciousnesses. So it's sort of object creating. So connecting what's going on visually, auditorily, by smell, and then creating objects that hold all of those properties together. For none of those, for those 6 sense consciousness, is subjectivity required. There's not necessarily anything it's like to be seeing. There's not necessarily anything it's like to be thinking. Thinking and seeing and so on can go on without subjective awareness. So subjectivity arises with a 7th consciousness and an 8th consciousness. We can talk more about that. What's interesting about the arising of subjectivity, it's connected with the evolution of new infrastructures for consciousness, language and culture. So Buddhists talk quite a lot about language and the way in which language structures consciousness and the problems with that. In the same way that with cultures, a culture is a way of getting things done for shared consciousness. And it's an infrastructure for realizing shared intentionality. That's a good thing. But like any other infrastructure, once it's been in place for a while, it starts to determine what kinds of shared consciousness you can have. So it sets norms for what's allowable differentiation. So the idea of coherent differentiation, what kind of runs through the whole understanding of consciousness from the Buddhist standpoint. So coherence and differentiation are 2 core values for understanding what's going on. And when we're engaging systems like intelligent technology or cultural systems that have to do, say, with gender and so on, what we're looking at is to try to figure out how do you maintain the conditions for coherence, that is things holding together over time, but also conserving the possibility for creative differentiation. So that becomes crucial. I think that maybe answered a bit of Tao's question as well.
Hopefully, sorry.
Hopefully.
We're
running out of
over
time, so
time and the break is short.
As people
Yeah.
have been saying, we'll take it offline.
Yeah, take it offline. Sorry, everyone. Lots of good conversation to have over coffee. Thanks again, everyone.
We return at 11:15, so you may want to